This is my second video on TEOMCROTE, the end of mankind's current reign over the planet. It might be easier to call it civilization reboot, which kind of makes it clear, the end of civilization. There are two problems with that. Current culture, global culture, is not civilized and therefore should not be called civilization. And it doesn't make clear that it's about the end. Civilization reboot implies the end of civilization, but even some terrorists might think it's about a need to destroy the planet and a need to reboot civilization, which is not what this is about. It's not some kind of comic. It's not about some kind of topic you would find in a comic book where someone's aiming to destroy the planet and therefore civilization needs to be rebooted. It's about cosmological cycles. This is not about some religious predictions in the Bible or something. It's not about wild speculation. It's not about alien information given to some sainted person or something. It's about science. It's about hard scientific data that modern culture refuses to embrace. What it's really about, for me, and I think it should be for anyone, is about a kind of insurance for civilization. But of course it's not about civilization. But it's about what happens if all of our technology disappears and we're thrown back into a Stone Age. Mankind just crawled out of the Stone Age a few thousand years ago, but genetically speaking, it's an impossibility that we just developed into a sentient species a few thousand years ago. So it's utterly acceptable that we were wiped out. Our ancestors were wiped out a few thousand years ago. So we should prepare. You have a car insurance, you have a fire insurance. Mankind should have an insurance in case something wild happens. And there's all kind of scientific data that suggests that wild things happen, cosmologically and astronomically speaking. And we could talk about Nibiru, and maybe Nibiru comes close to the planet and disrupts the planet, jolts it somehow. That has to do with electricity, because as all bodies that cross through space, our planet collects a strong negative charge, and when another body passes through space, it also collects negative charge, and two negative charges repel each other. And this is probably why planets exist at all, because there are all these heavenly bodies. I mean, we're struck by 50 asteroids or meteorites every day, but in 4.5 billion years our planet has not been destroyed. This has to do with electricity, if you will. It has to do with electrical charge. We have a north and a south pole, but the galaxy as well has a north and a south pole. Now, what we find is that data suggests that every 13,000 years ago or so, the planet undergoes massive global disruption. And this 13,000 year number, it comes up in all kinds of disciplines. And one of which is that every 26,000, which is 2 times 13 obviously, the solar system changes its polar setting. So north becomes south and south becomes north. Has to do with the galaxy. The galaxy actually changes its north and south orientation as well. So since everything is orientated according to basic electricity to correspond with each other, then it's not that strange an idea that if the planet has a north and south, that either it's turning, okay, see, now it's turning this way, these fingers are going that direction. Now, what if the whole planet were to turn on its head? Then it would go that way. And you might say, oh, that's impossible. What kind of force could do that? Well, the electrical forces that rule the whole universe could do that. And what's to stop the planet from doing that? Because we're in space, right? So everything's empty around the planet. So if we were to flip, what kind of forces are stopping the planet from flipping? There's no friction. There's nothing keeping it in place. So if we're turning like this, and we turn around, and we keep turning the same way, right? We're turning this way, and then we're turning this way. One is going that way, and one is going that way. And what does the historical data show us? That previous cultures actually saw that the sun came up in the west. So these are things that suggest that electricity rules our existence, rules the planet, rules the universe. But if the planet turns from this to this, that would still cause, if the planet flips, which is a mass like this, still the atmosphere around the planet has to come with it. But if the mass of the planet flips like this, the atmosphere isn't going to come along. The mass might flip like this. The atmosphere, it's going to be dragged along a bit, but it's not going to flip at the same rate as the mass, which means there's going to be massive wind turbulence. And right now, the planet is turning like this, and the air is turning around at 1,000 kilometers an hour. And imagine that kind of force is caused to disrupt the planet. I mean, like I said, tornadoes 250 kilometers per hour in the center, the biggest tornadoes. So we're talking this strong destructive winds that would carry debris and destroy everything. We're talking many times the destructive force of the greatest tornadoes. And the waters as well would not come along as quickly as the mass. If this is the water and this is the mass, then the waters would kind of hold back and then come crashing over the land. So you're talking mega tsunamis and mega hurricanes. This alone would destroy all civilization. I prefer the new term TEOMCROTE, the end of mankind's current reign over the earth, because then you make it clear as well how bad it is. We're talking about a new Stone Age. And since mankind was in the Stone Age just a few thousand years ago, this is really the main thing to go by. We have no reason to feel safe. So we should have an insurance. It's that simple. You have fire insurance, and then if your house burns down, you can buy a new house. But if you don't have a fire insurance and your house burns down, you could be screwed for the rest of your life. Everything you built up, destroyed, and you could be a pauper, you could be homeless for the rest of your life. You could be really screwed. And that's probably what happened to mankind many times before. As I said, this 13,000 year cycle, we find it in everything, all kinds of cosmological and geological cycles. And we should be serious about it. But unfortunately, nobody is being serious about it. So, a mature adult would take it into account, even if the whole world is ignoring it. So that's why I call it TEOMCROTE instead of Civilization Reboot. But if I say Civilization Reboot, you know what I mean. But you also know that I'm not talking about civilization. Actually, a lot of people might think if the mankind, modern culture, civilization is wiped off the planet, that would be a good thing for the planet, for all kinds of species that are becoming extinct because of us. But I will also be talking about how true civilization can be established. So then I'm not talking about civilization reboot, because there's nothing to reboot, but something that might be established. I will be getting into all these things. There are other things to consider, because I'm telling you a lot of information, and information overload is a real threat. I understand that. I've been learning these things for the last 10 years, and to throw everything I've learned after daily research and keeping my eyes and ears open for this kind of reality, to throw all that in your lap at once causes information overload. And how can you cope with that? I will be getting into that, how you can cope with that. So civilization reboot is a big deal because it takes a lot of information and a lot of understanding to be able to survive it and to be able to establish civilization afterwards. I've already mentioned there are some things like concrete and glass. They're actually very simple. But if you've never looked into it, it's a big deal. Glass, for instance, took thousands of years before the first people made the first glass. But it's really funny if you look into it, as I have. You find out that, and here's just a little trick to remember it by, everything you need to find glass you can find at the seashore. 3 things to make glass: sodium, calcium, and sand, silica. And if you just know the percentages of these, then you can make glass. The sodium is in the seaweed, which you can just burn and then soak, and it's not too hard to get the sodium out of there. The calcium is in the shells, and the sand provides the silica. So you have the right combinations, you have the right percentages, and you can make glass. But if you don't, you're living in a world without glass. So that's a great handicap right there. You're talking about Stone Age situation. And the Stone Age, you might think, great, I'll make a tent, I'll make a hut, and I'll be happy. But there are 2 considerations, one for you personally and for mankind as a whole, because mankind suffered millennia of barbarism and wars, fighting over resources and all this stuff, and it's not necessary to go through 10,000 years of suffering again. So the civilization insurance, if you want to call it that, it's not just about you personally, it's about mankind. I mean, can you feel empathy for all the innocents that will suffer 10,000 years until mankind gets back on its feet again? Now you might say, barbarians can be very happy, and this is true. But barbarians tend to fight with each other over resources, and I will also be getting into why that is, because current research, psychological research in particular, has taught us, not the scientific consensus, but it has taught mankind, the data is out there, why we do what we do. And all this information I can supply. So I also need to inform you how you can absorb this information without getting information overload. In order to prevent information overload, it's necessary that I help you along with a few principles. And one is that there are 4 steps to consider with all of this. The first is you need to know yourself. So this is about information overload as well. It's about understanding humanity. It's understanding what it means to be a human. And there are all kind of processes that are known to modern research, but that are not commonly known. So that's important. You need to know, understand other people, how you relate to other people, what other people do, why they refuse to embrace this simple principle, like to have an insurance for civilization. You need to understand about location. What is the geologic reality? What's a safe location? Are there safe locations? Yes, there are, but you need to know them. You need to understand why certain locations are safe and others are not. And the 4th important principle is that failing to plan is planning to fail. You have to have the insurance, you have to have certain knowledge, or you will die just like our ancestors died. Knowing yourself is knowing about how the brain works, this information overload principle. So that's very important, otherwise you can't absorb the information. But there's knowing others, how you relate to others. This solidarity principle I mentioned in the introduction. Data shows that 75% of mankind has lost touch with their empathy. So they don't care about future generations. If you belong to the 25%, you can have an empathic connection with future generations. If you belong to the 75%, you can experience that as a matter of principle. But it's good to understand this. Otherwise, you may be feeling a solidarity towards others that is inappropriate and self-destructive, just as the 75% are inherently self-destructive in their attitudes. Location you may find very interesting. I have deemed 2 locations very safe. One is very expensive and far away, the island of Papua. But there's another one that's far more accessible and affordable to people, and that is the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. These are very stable, unlike many other mountain ranges and such, and continents. The most stable continent, geologically speaking, is Africa. The center of Africa is in Egypt. Actually, the Great Pyramids are at the center. But Africa as a whole is very stable, and the Atlas Mountains are ancient, billions of years old. That means when the whole planet experiences mega earthquakes, the Atlas Mountains are safe. That means that the caves in the Atlas Mountains are safe. So this is the place to be. Other places, you can dig a hole, you can make a bunker, and maybe the whole earth will be shook in such a way that you can never hope to survive. After all, there's just the basic principle. Our ancestors did not die for nothing. Previous global civilizations were not destroyed, wiped off the face of the planet for nothing. Our ancestors were not retarded. Genetically speaking, they were our equals. Considering the constructs they built, like Pumapunku and the Great Pyramid, they were technologically very advanced. These were not stupid people, and yet they were wiped off the face of the planet. Now, we do not know exactly how they got wiped off the face of the planet. It could be that the planet flipped. It could be that the planet started turning the other direction. Because as well, historical accounts suggest that the sun stayed in the same spot for 3 days, and then the sun came up in the opposite direction. So first it was west, and then it was east for our ancestors. And that would mean as well a total destruction of all civilization. It doesn't really matter how. We know one thing. Our ancestors were wiped off the face of the planet, and they were not stupid. Now, modern culture, their attitude is full of hubris, that we are somehow superior to our ancestors, which is ridiculous. It's just unscientific. So this civilization insurance is just a matter of being mature. Now imagine you were living in a valley where there's a flood every 50 years. There's like this cycle, natural cycle, that the valley floods every 50 years. And imagine you were born 1 year after the last flood. That means you would be 49 years old, same age I am now, when the next flood comes. But you grew up your whole life experiencing, from personal experience, that the valley's safe. All you've ever known is that the valley was quiet and everything was green and people built their houses and planned their futures, blah, blah, blah. Though anybody who knows about that valley, geologists or historians, know that a flood is going to come. It would not feel to you like something real. And yet, the scientists point out that the data is clear. There's going to be a flood. Now imagine a cycle of 13,000 years that even our remote ancestors of thousands of years ago, they've never experienced this. That means the whole culture would be influenced by this hubris that everything is fine. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. The data points to massive destruction every 13,000 years. It also points to considerable destruction every 4,300 years. But, and even that is a long enough time for everybody to forget or ignore, or because of like mass trauma to put it into the subconscious. But it doesn't make it any less real. So you can accept the data, or you can ignore it. You can ignore it because it doesn't feel right. But just like the person who grew up in the valley that's safe, your feelings aren't always good guidelines. And we live in a culture that ignores feelings. Let's face it. Okay, well, anyway, that's what the data shows too, that especially feelings are something that gets suppressed in our culture. And that's just psychological data. That's not popular, that's not taught at universities, but it is very scientific. It's scholarly research. So there are all kinds of reasons why you could ignore the data, but doing so is rather suicidal. So a mature, sane adult would have a kind of civilization insurance. Out of empathy for future generations, and out of an understanding that it's otherwise suicide, and your basic survival instincts should then push you to take action. Now, no one is taking action because the 25% who can feel empathy, they especially feel empathy for the 75% who are ignoring all of this. And there are these psychological things taking place, and that influences the culture, and it influences all individuals. But the data is the data, and the common sense is the common sense, and the main common sense being our ancestors were wiped off the face of the planet. So a sane, mature adult should be able to just accept this and take appropriate action. It doesn't mean they have to forgo everything, and it doesn't mean that they have to become hermits or any of this. Just you take out an insurance. So this doesn't have to cost too much money. This, I'm sure, is another big concern of anybody who's thinking about the end of the world. I don't have the knowledge. I don't have the money. What am I going to do surviving alone? All these things, yes, they're real. They're real concerns. But a bigger concern is 10,000 years of barbarism for future generations and your imminent death.